Hello there, Group 2. I was wondering when in this course I would get out of my comfort zone and do a video response. Module 7 definitely is the one that resonated with me that would best fit this. And the reason for that is this topic of spec ed and the resources and some of the shortfalls that we're experiencing in public boards, especially in our region, really resonates with me both as a parent and a principal. And I just feel like the passion that I have for this topic wouldn't really show up in written form or typing a response. So I'm going to be speaking to you on some of the points that I would like to talk to you about this article, this report. So in 2014, People for Education, which is basically a watch group for public education that advocates for students and families, released a special education report. And the main thing to note from this special education report is there's a large increasing number of students accessing special education resources in Ontario publicly funded schools, and the budget that the Ontario government has for spec ed, although large, isn't increasing at the same proportion. And by special education resources, we're talking about anything from minor accommodations to full-out one-on-one support, or in some cases multiple person support to support a student. Why is this? Why are we having a sudden spike in the last 4 or 5 years? Some of it could be just, we're catching it, we're diagnosing it a lot better than in previous years. Not to say that maybe the same amount of students didn't have these exceptionalities, we just know more about it now. In my case, I have a son with autism, and growing up I think I only knew one person ever who had autism, and the rate now is 1 in 68. And just in our own school I'd never really experienced that before. We've experienced it twice in the last 2 years. Last year my son was in JK, and this year we have another student in JK. So we are learning a lot more about these exceptionalities and how to best try and support those students. The provincial budget was $2.72 billion, which is a lot of money, yet 79% of public boards in Ontario reported spending more than their budget. And not that I'm the financial controller for our board, but I can say with certainty we were one of those 79%. And in the region, we definitely have a shortfall in spec ed funding to support our students. The study kind of looked at 4 key supports and analyzing how these supports best serve special education students and what some of the shortfalls are. The first one is special education resource teachers. And there's an alarming ratio of 37-1 in elementary and 74-1 in secondary of students to certs in publicly funded Ontario schools. EAs was the next support it looked at, and the ratio was a little bit lower. Elementary was 22-1, secondary 58-1. Assistive technology was the next key factor that the article looked at. And although with assistive technology, this is in an IEP for students or a psychological assessment, it was reported that 44% of students in elementary and 33% in secondary who were supposed to be using assistive technology did not have access to this assistive technology. And that is a rather high alarming rate. An example of the assistive technology is like the iPad, for example. With students with autism, this is a great communication tool and a great learning tool. Some of the barriers with this are like the SIA claim process. I know last year with Caesar, he never got his iPad through the SIA process until April. And for the students this year who have put in for some different SIA claims, some of which was assistive technology, it's looking like, again, it'll be April by the time it gets through all the red tape and process, that the student will finally have access to what they need to best support them, which is kind of a travesty, really, when you think about it. They only get 2 months in the school year to then continue on and use it. But getting it is one thing. Knowing how to use it is another barrier. And that goes for the teachers, the CERTs, the EAs, and the students. And in some cases, if that technology goes home, the parents. It's one thing to have it, but it's another thing to know how to use it properly. And that seems to be one of the forgotten things in this whole process, is the training piece on how to best use this technology to support learning. One thing our board does, because there is a stigma sometimes associated with using technology, is we do kind of do the technology for all students. From 4 to 12, grades 4 to 12, all students have access to a Chromebook if they're a KP student. And the lower grades have access to netbooks. And that follows them throughout their school career within the board. And it's one thing we do to try to support, 21st century culture of learning. But it also, for the students, they're not singled out if they're using it, if everybody technically has access to it. Another part, and this is where I'm going to focus a little bit more on now, is partnering agencies and other support staff. In our region, Firefly is a major service provider, and they provide like occupational therapy, physiotherapy, and speech pathology. And in the region, and I'm sure this is elsewhere in the province as well, there really needs to be a better integration between community agencies and schools to best support students and families. Recently, while I was traveling back to Sioux Lookout, there was a video conference from the Ontario Centre of Excellence for Child and Youth Mental Health. And what it is, it's another kind of watchdog group that analyzes the efficiencies of ministry providers such as Firefly. And I was very surprised. I found out about this at 6 p.m. and the video conference started at 6 p.m. And it was rather random, like Firefly did let us know right at the last minute about it. But this was for the whole region. And there was representation in Sioux Lookout and Fort Frances for a total of 8 people. There was nobody from Red Lake, Kenora, Dryden, or any of the other smaller rural communities, which kind of then again reinforces that point I made about better integration between community agencies and schools. There's a lack of awareness of some of these providers' roles and how to access these services. I know myself, being a new parent with Caesar, once you get that diagnosis, it can be a scary thing, and you don't really know who can help you or what role they play. And in our case with Firefly, I think they need to do a better job of promoting what their mandate is and how to access their services. And we are a very geographic region, Northwestern Ontario, and living in Pickle Lake, we're one of the outlier communities, and I know one of our challenges is to get those services up here regularly. It's been much better this year to have the speech, the OT, and the physio here. Just last week we had all 3 here working with our students. But interestingly, when I did move up here originally, Firefly wanted to close my son's case. And just irated me because I worked so hard to get him into the system to begin with, and they have a mandate to service this region. And they were just kind of like, oh, well, the school board can kind of look after it. Well, yes, we do have our role too, but I was very disappointed. And at the end, they didn't close his file, but that's because I was a strong advocate as a parent and as the principal of the school. And I wonder how many other families who might not have that knowledge maybe do have their cases closed. So moving on, access to assessments and psychologists. That is a major problem for our region as well. In the report, somebody from within our board actually made that point. Psychologists might make it to town a couple times per year. Much more is needed, but geography is a huge challenge in Northwestern Ontario. Some boards have instilled hard caps, like we will only do 2 a year per school. And part of it is the supply and demand of getting the psychologists into the schools. In our region, it is very hard. We don't have a hard cap that I've been told of, but I'm in my second year here and I haven't seen anybody yet. I know there is a doctor later this year that is scheduled to do 1 or 2 tests with some of our students, and hopefully that helps. The alternative is sometimes parents have the option of getting that service privately. The problem with that is it's very expensive. It can be anywhere between $2, $3, $4, $5,000 depending on the length and the travel and everything else associated with that assessment. And the reality is in our region, rural northwestern Ontario, there aren't a lot of parents that can afford that, so they really rely on the public sector, the school boards, to provide that service for their kids. And with the increase in prevalence, with the different exceptionalities, this is one barrier that the whole system is experiencing, is timely intervention. A point that was made in the article: success, early intervention. When additional supports are provided early, it reduces the number of students who will require intensive support in later years. The challenge, of course, is getting those initial assessments. I look back at my own situation with Caesar, and we first started the process when he was 2. We finally had the diagnosis a month after he was 4, and he's now into the IBI program, and there was a chance he wasn't going to get into it until September of next year or March of the following year. So we were very lucky a spot opened up in the region. The last part of this article I just want to talk about are some of the changes to special education funding that is happening in the province. There's been a number of them recently, and we're just starting to see the impacts this year and a little bit last year. The historical high needs amount has been reduced 25% per year and will for 3 years. And there's also supposed to be some rejigging of the numbers based on some special education statistical prediction model numbers, as well as measures of variability. Now, in our region, when you look at that, you would think that would benefit us. We would be one of the boards that might benefit from that, but the reality is we aren't. We've actually, there's no new money, so they're just reallocating it. We're one of the ones that definitely saw a cut of it so that someone else would get more. Now, granted, our student population is much lower than, say, the GTA area, but the reality is we have a number of high rate of exceptionalities in our region, whether it's FASD or other learning disabilities, and the new formula is definitely not helping our board and our students the way that I think it might have been intended to originally. And we do have some strong advocates at the provincial level. I know our director works tirelessly trying to advocate for our students and our families to get the services that they need. Lastly, the article had some recommendations. It talked a little bit about potentially having a special education ombudsman, which would I could see some benefit coming from that, for sure. Another thing that kind of came up in the article, and I'll touch upon a bit as well, was there should be no situation where a child is unable to attend school for the full day due to a shortage of resources. And I did make a point in here that this is a standard practice that is happening. There's been almost half of elementary principals and 41% of secondary principals reported at some point when the study came out that year, they had to ask a family to have their students stay at home for all or part of the day due to lack of resources. And I myself, I've experienced that twice this year, and I can tell you that absolutely irritates me as a parent and an educator when you're told your kid can't be at school today because we can't cover him off. And I understand that sometimes the lines get blurred between safety concerns and lack of adequate resources, and I don't want to get all educational act and quote that, but it does state there between the age of 6 and 18 you are required to attend school unless excused. So I think in our region, part of that's an internal issue and kind of goes back to the whole issue of recruiting. We do have a lack of people here in this region. We are spread out. It is very geographic. Our board, I believe, needs to have a stronger recruiting initiative so that we don't get into a position where parents are asked to keep their kids at home. We do have a a bank of casuals or people that we can move around in particular days. So yeah, that rant there, sorry about that. Back on track. Another recommendation was to monitor and impact the changes of the spec ed funding model. Like I mentioned, it is still early in these changes, but I can say for certainty, year 2 into it, not benefiting the students at KPDSB. We're hoping that our director can advocate for us and help us out with that. And what that causes is basically you have to make tough choices. You only get so much, and this is everywhere, even before the changes in the model. And you really have to allocate those resources the best you can, and very tough decisions and choices are made. And they're not ideal, and they're not what's best for kids, which is what our mission statement is in our board, putting kids first. All stakeholders put students first. And then the last recommendation the article makes is standardized process for assessment, identification, placement, and provide adequate, timely, equitable services to access education for every Ontario child. That's not just a school thing, that's the community partners that I touched upon. And I'm not sure how that's going to look. I'm optimistic that we'll get there. But in our region, where we're so large, so geographic, and in a lot of cases very rural, similar to our own internal getting resources, I know some of these agencies also experience high turnover, a lot of transition in their employees, and that's part of the problem as well. But we need to get there. We all need to work hard, the government, the public agencies, the school board, the teachers, the parents, and we'll get there. Thanks for listening, Group 2.